Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union from the late 1920s until his death in 1953, was known as the Man of Steel. Yet behind that name was not resilience, but a blood-stained reign in which fear became the law of the land. The Great Purge, Stalin's reign of terror over the Soviet Union. Historical background and Stalin's rise to power. After Lenin's death in 1924, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union descended into fierce struggles for succession. Stalin, who was not as brilliant a theoretician as Trotsky, proved himself shrewd, patient, and ruthlessly pragmatic. Step by step, he outmaneuvered his rivals, consolidated power, and established himself as the unchallenged leader. By the mid-1930s, Stalin had secured near-absolute control over the party, the state, and the security apparatus. Yet, he remained haunted by paranoia, convinced that hidden enemies lurked within the Soviet system, waiting to sabotage socialism from within. The assassination of Kirov, 1934, a bloody prelude. On December 1, 1934, Sergei Kirov, a rising star in the Communist Party and a figure widely admired by the Soviet public, was assassinated in Leningrad. Many historians suspect Stalin orchestrated the murder to create a pretext for a massive crackdown. Seizing on the event, Stalin claimed a vast, counter-revolutionary conspiracy was threatening the state. The stage was set for one of the bloodiest political campaigns in modern history. The Moscow Show trials, pre-written tragedies. From 1936 to 1938, the infamous Moscow trials unfolded. Leading Bolsheviks who had once stood alongside Lenin, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, were paraded before the courts. These trials were broadcast and publicized to demonstrate the justice of the Soviet system. In reality, they were meticulously staged dramas. Defendants were tortured or threatened into confessing to absurd charges, espionage for Nazi Germany, treason, sabotage. Sentences were predetermined, execution or decades in labor camps. The trials symbolized the terrifying extent to which Stalin's paranoia had corrupted the legal system. The Red Army decapitated. One of the gravest blows fell upon the military. Stalin accused top commanders of treachery. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, a brilliant strategist, was accused of spying for the Nazis and swiftly executed. Within 2 years, the Red Army's leadership was decimated, 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, and thousands of officers were purged. This catastrophe left the Soviet Union gravely unprepared when Nazi Germany invaded in 1941. The Gulag Archipelago, hell on earth. Those not executed were shipped to the sprawling network of labor camps known as the Gulag. Intellectuals, engineers, teachers, peasants, and workers alike could be denounced as enemies of the people for the flimsiest reasons, a careless word, foreign correspondence, or even a neighbor's suspicion. In the Gulag, prisoners endured forced labor under brutal conditions, logging in the frozen taiga, mining in Siberia, or constructing canals by hand. Hunger, disease, and cold claimed countless lives. Alexander Solzhenitsyn would later immortalize this system as the Gulag Archipelago. A nation paralyzed by fear. During the Great Purge, terror seeped into every layer of Soviet society. No one felt safe, not even loyal communists or Stalin's closest allies. Families were torn apart. Children were pressured to renounce parents branded as traitors. Citizens lived in constant dread, whispering only in private, afraid that a careless remark might lead to arrest. Denunciation became a survival tactic. Neighbors, colleagues, even relatives turned against one another to protect themselves. Chilling statistics. Between 1936 and 1938, more than 1.5 million people were arrested. Approximately 700,000 were executed, shot in the back of the head after perfunctory trials. Millions more were sentenced to Gulag labor camps. Historians regard this as one of the deadliest state-led campaigns of political repression in human history. Long-term consequences. The Great Purge not only destroyed countless innocent lives but also crippled Soviet society. The intellectual class was gutted, innovation was stifled, and military leadership was annihilated. A culture of silence and obedience replaced debate and creativity. When the Soviet Union faced Hitler's invasion, the earlier purges exacted a devastating price. Inexperienced officers led an army stripped of its finest strategists. The legacy of terror. Although Stalin later became celebrated as the leader who steered the USSR to victory in World War II, the shadow of the Great Purge never lifted. It left deep scars in the Soviet psyche, trauma, fear, and mistrust. The purge stands today as a symbol of authoritarian cruelty and paranoid violence, a stark reminder of how absolute power can turn against the very people it claims to defend. Gulag, the frozen hell of Stalin's empire. The birth of the Gulag. The Gulag, the infamous network of forced labor camps, became one of the most terrifying symbols of Stalin's Soviet Union. Though labor camps had existed since the early days after the Bolshevik Revolution, it was under Stalin that the system expanded into an empire of repression. Ostensibly created to re-educate criminals and enemies of the state through labor, in reality the Gulag was designed to break human beings physically and spiritually, while exploiting their labor for the needs of the state. The vast network across Siberia. By the mid-1930s, the Gulag stretched like a shadow across the Soviet landscape. From the frozen wastelands of Kolyma in the Far East, to the mines of Vorkuta above the Arctic Circle, to the forests of Karelia, millions of prisoners were scattered across hundreds of camps. Siberia, with its desolate tundra and lethal winters, became the ultimate dumping ground for those deemed expendable by the regime. Transportation was brutal. Cattle cars packed with human beings were hauled for weeks in freezing temperatures, many dying before even reaching the camps. The scale of repression. Historians estimate that between 1930 and 1953, more than 18 million people passed through the Gulag system. They included political prisoners, intellectuals, peasants accused of resisting collectivization, religious believers, military officers, ethnic minorities, and ordinary citizens who had spoken a careless word. Entire families were torn apart, husbands and wives separated, children left orphans. The Gulag became a mechanism to silence dissent, eliminate enemies, and instill fear throughout Soviet society. Life and death in the camps. Conditions were hellish. Prisoners worked grueling shifts, 12 to 16 hours a day. In mines, logging camps, construction projects, and factories. Tools were primitive, food rations were meager, and clothing inadequate for the climate. In places like Kolyma, winter temperatures plunged to -50 degrees Celsius. Frostbite, scurvy, typhus, and exhaustion claimed countless lives. Hunger gnawed at every prisoner, bread was currency, survival depended on scraps. Guards beat inmates mercilessly, while criminal gangs preyed on weaker prisoners. The toll of death. The Gulag was not designed merely to punish, it was a machine of attrition. Mortality rates soared during the harshest years of Stalin's rule. In some camps, 1 in 4 prisoners perished within a year. Corpses piled up, frozen in the snow, then dumped into mass graves or buried in shallow pits. Survivors recalled the eerie sight of bodies stacked like logs, stiff from the cold. Death was ever present, through starvation, disease, exposure, or execution. Psychological torment. Beyond physical suffering, the Gulag inflicted psychological torture. Prisoners lost their identity, reduced to numbers. Letters were censored, families often never heard from again. Hope evaporated as sentences were arbitrarily extended. Betrayal became routine, a whispered denunciation could condemn someone to years of hell. Even release was no guarantee, many returned broken, shunned as former enemies, and lived under constant surveillance. A tool of Stalin's rule. The Gulag was more than punishment, it was a pillar of Stalin's regime. It provided cheap labor for massive state projects, railways, canals, mines, and factories. Whole cities, like Norilsk and Magadan, were built on the bones of prisoners. At the same time, the Gulag served as a warning to society, obedience meant survival, dissent meant disappearance into the frozen abyss. It embodied the logic of totalitarian power, human beings as disposable instruments. Testimonies of survival. Memoirs and accounts by survivors, such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago and Varlam Shalamov's Kolyma Tales, reveal the unthinkable brutality. They describe the slow erosion of humanity, the desperate struggle for a crust of bread, the moral compromises made to endure another day. Yet they also testify to resilience, acts of kindness, solidarity, and memory preserved even in the bleakest conditions. Legacy of horror. By the time of Stalin's death in 1953, millions had suffered in the Gulag, and at least 2 to 3 million had died within it. Though the camps were gradually dismantled during the Khrushchev era, their memory haunts Russian history. The Gulag stands as a stark reminder of how ideology, paranoia, and absolute power can transform a nation into a prison. It symbolizes systemic cruelty, where individuals were stripped of dignity, turned into tools of labor, then discarded as refuse. Conclusion. The Gulag was not merely a collection of camps, it was an entire civilization of repression, a frozen empire of fear. It scarred generations, destroyed families, and left behind a legacy of silence and trauma. In the end, it became the clearest expression of Stalinism's darkest truth, that in pursuit of power, human lives could be reduced to nothing, and suffering could be institutionalized on a scale that still shocks the conscience of the world. Introduction, defining the Holodomor. The Holodomor, from holod, hunger, and mority, to kill, refers to the catastrophic famine that struck Soviet Ukraine in 1932 to 1933. Unlike famines caused by natural disasters, this tragedy was overwhelmingly man-made. Stalin's regime imposed impossible grain quotas, confiscated food, and sealed borders, leaving millions without the means to survive. Scholars estimate between 3 and 7 million deaths, though some argue for higher numbers. Regardless of the precise toll, the famine stands among the most devastating humanitarian disasters of the 20th century. Ukraine, known as the breadbasket of Europe, was deliberately targeted because of its agricultural wealth and its national distinctiveness. Stalin aimed not only to extract grain for industrialization but also to break Ukrainian resistance and suppress its cultural revival. The Holodomor thus was more than a policy failure, it was an exercise of power that weaponized hunger. Villages were stripped of food, peasants prevented from escaping, and any act of survival, such as hiding a sack of flour, was criminalized. Families disintegrated, communities vanished, and fields lay silent, dotted with corpses. To Ukrainians, this was not merely famine but genocide, an attempt to destroy a people by. Historical background, Soviet policies in the 1920s. After the Civil War, Lenin's new economic policy, NEP, allowed peasants to sell surplus grain after paying tax. Agriculture revived, and Ukraine again flourished. At the same time, a policy of korenizatsiya encouraged Ukrainian culture and language. For a brief period, Ukrainian society experienced both economic recovery and cultural renaissance. This balance collapsed after Stalin seized power in the late 1920s. Determined to industrialize rapidly, he launched the first five-year plan and forced collectivization of agriculture. Independent farmers were branded kulaks and denounced as class enemies. In practice, the kulak label was applied broadly, anyone resisting collectivization risked confiscation, deportation, or execution. The result was social chaos. Millions of livestock were slaughtered rather than surrendered to the state. Productivity fell sharply as peasants lost incentives to work. Yet instead of relaxing demands, Moscow imposed harsher grain quotas. Ukraine, as the Soviet breadbasket, was hit hardest. By 1931, tension between the state and the countryside had reached breaking point, paving the way for famine. Collectivization and the transformation of Ukrainian agriculture. Collectivization was both an economic gamble and a political weapon. Stalin sought to turn scattered peasant farms into collective, kolkhoz, and state farms, sovkhoz, giving Moscow control over grain. Ukraine, with its fertile black earth, was central to this vision. Peasants resisted fiercely, slaughtering animals and hiding crops. In response, the state launched dekulakization, deporting over 1 million families and labeling them enemies of the people. Special brigades raided homes, seizing every scrap of grain. Villages that resisted were blacklisted, cut off from supplies and condemned to starve. New laws criminalized taking even leftover stalks from fields. The impact was disastrous. Agricultural output collapsed, while requisition demands rose. Peasants were trapped, unable to leave their villages due to internal passports, stripped of property, and left with nothing. Hunger spread rapidly. Instead of prosperity, collectivization brought devastation, leaving Ukraine on the brink of catastrophe. The political logic of Stalin's decisions. Stalin's policies in Ukraine cannot be understood solely as economic mismanagement. They were deeply political. At the heart of collectivization and the famine was the drive to consolidate Stalin's personal power and eliminate any challenge to Moscow's authority. Ukraine posed a special problem. Its fertile land made it indispensable, but its strong national identity and cultural revival of the 1920s raised fears of separatism. Stalin viewed Ukrainian peasants and intellectuals not just as obstacles to grain requisition but as a potential threat to Soviet unity. By tightening grain quotas and refusing to reduce demands even when harvests failed, Stalin ensured that Ukraine remained dependent and submissive. He saw hunger as a weapon. If peasants were starving, they would be too weak to resist. At the same time, Moscow cracked down on Ukrainian culture. Writers, teachers, and political leaders were arrested, accused of nationalism or counter-revolution, and deported to the Gulag. The famine thus coincided with a campaign of political repression that silenced Ukrainian voices. Stalin also used the crisis to discipline the Communist Party itself. Local officials who failed to deliver quotas were punished, ensuring obedience through fear. The famine was therefore not only an instrument against the countryside but also a demonstration of absolute control. For Stalin, the suffering of millions was acceptable collateral in the pursuit of power. Grain requisition and confiscations. The direct mechanism of the famine was the confiscation of food. Throughout 1932, brigades of party activists and NKVD agents swept through Ukrainian villages, searching homes, barns, and even ovens for hidden grain. They used iron rods to probe floors and walls, confiscating not only grain but also potatoes, vegetables, and livestock. Families were left with nothing. Moscow's quotas were impossibly high. Even when harvests declined, demands increased. Officials who failed to meet targets faced arrest, so they stripped villages bare. The infamous Law of 5 Ears of Corn made it a crime punishable by execution to collect leftover grain from fields. Thousands were shot for the smallest attempts to feed their families. Blacklisting deepened the horror. Villages accused of resistance were surrounded, cut off from trade, and denied supplies. Armed guards prevented peasants from leaving to seek food elsewhere. Starvation became inevitable. Mothers fed children grass or bark, entire families collapsed in their huts. Eyewitnesses described villages where silence reigned, broken only by the moans of the dying. The requisition system turned famine from a possibility into a certainty. Rather than adjust to reality, the state intensified pressure, ensuring that hunger became a deliberate instrument of terror. Grain taken from starving peasants was exported abroad or stored for urban centers. Everyday life in the villages during 1932 to 1933. Daily existence in Ukrainian villages during the Holodomor became a descent into horror. Once lively communities were transformed into landscapes of silence and despair. Families, stripped of their grain and livestock, faced empty barns and bare cupboards. Peasants survived on grass, acorns, or boiled leather, others dug up roots and weeds to make a bitter broth. Children grew gaunt and listless, their bellies swollen with hunger, their eyes dim. The famine disrupted every rhythm of rural life. Markets disappeared, schools closed, and church bells fell silent as institutions collapsed. Work on collective farms continued under duress, but starving peasants lacked the strength to till the soil. Corpses appeared on roadsides and in courtyards, sometimes left unburied for days because survivors were too weak to dig graves. The stench of decay mingled with the smoke of cooking fires that burned grass or straw instead of food. Social bonds frayed. Acts of compassion still occurred, but survival instincts often overpowered solidarity. Neighbors competed for scraps, some stole from each other's gardens or storerooms. Parents faced impossible choices, to eat themselves or to feed their children. Rumors of cannibalism spread, reflecting the extremes to which starvation pushed human beings. Villages that had once been vibrant with song and tradition became ghostly wastelands, haunted by silence and death. Eyewitness testimonies. The most haunting images of the Holodomor come from those who lived through it. Survivors recall endless hunger, skeletal bodies collapsing in the streets, and children crying with no tears left. One witness described her village as a cemetery without crosses, where people fell where they stood and lay uncollected. Another remembered neighbors boiling bark and feeding their children watery soup until even grass disappeared. Foreign journalists who managed to visit, like Gareth Jones, reported stark scenes of desolation, empty villages, swollen corpses, and peasants begging silently with hollow eyes. Their reports, however, were often dismissed or suppressed by Western correspondents more sympathetic to the Soviet experiment. Testimonies also reveal the brutality of enforcement. Families hiding a few handfuls of grain were raided, beaten, or deported. Children who picked kernels from fields risked execution. Survivors described the terror of nighttime knocks at the door, signaling searches by requisition squads. Memoirs written decades later, such as those collected by diaspora Ukrainians, convey the enduring trauma. For many, the famine was not just physical but psychological, a scar of betrayal, silence, and forgotten graves. The voices of these witnesses remain essential, for they transform numbers into faces, statistics into human suffering. Death toll, demographic and statistical debates. One of the most contentious issues surrounding the Holodomor is the true scale of death. Soviet authorities concealed the famine, falsified harvest reports, and suppressed census data. As a result, historians must reconstruct numbers from scattered archives, survivor accounts, and demographic analysis. Estimates range widely. Some suggest 3 to 4 million deaths, others up to 7 million, and certain Ukrainian scholars argue as high as 10 million. The 1937 Soviet census revealed catastrophic population losses, but Stalin declared it invalid, executed the census organizers, and replaced the figures with doctored numbers. Later censuses also underreported the devastation. Demographers analyzing birth and death rates note a collapse of fertility in 1932 to 1933, millions of missing births compounded the toll. Entire villages vanished from the map, their populations erased. Regardless of exact figures, the demographic impact was profound. Ukraine lost a generation of peasants, cultural bearers, and potential future citizens. Families were obliterated, and social continuity was shattered. The famine also disproportionately struck rural areas, ensuring that Ukraine's countryside, its historic heart, was weakened for decades. The debate over numbers reflects more than academic interest, it is a struggle over memory, accountability, and recognition of genocide. The role of the Soviet secret police, OGPU/NKVD. Behind the famine stood the machinery of repression, the Soviet secret police, first the OGPU and later the NKVD. These organizations enforced collectivization, executed dekulakization, and carried out the grain seizures that starved millions. Their brigades swept through villages, conducting searches with iron rods, confiscating hidden food, and punishing speculators with deportation or death. The NKVD also administered blacklists. Entire communities accused of resistance were encircled, denied supplies, and effectively sentenced to slow starvation. Travel restrictions were enforced through internal passports, starving peasants attempting to flee were arrested at railway stations or turned back at borders. Beyond enforcement, the secret police targeted Ukrainian intellectuals, clergy, and cultural leaders, accusing them of nationalism or conspiracy. Thousands were executed or sent to gulag camps, silencing potential voices of protest. Fear was omnipresent. The knock at the door could mean arrest, exile, or disappearance. The famine thus cannot be separated from repression. Hunger was not an accident, it was backed by state terror. The OGPU and NKVD ensured that starvation served as a tool of political control, breaking resistance in the countryside and demonstrating Moscow's ruthless power. Deportations and the link to the Gulag. The Holodomor was not only a famine but also a vast machinery of deportation and forced labor. Families branded as kulaks, grain hoarders, or political suspects were loaded onto trains and sent eastward into exile. Siberia, Kazakhstan, and the Arctic North absorbed millions of deportees who had little chance of survival. Many died en route, packed into unheated cattle cars without food or water. Those who reached their destinations often faced the Gulag, a network of labor camps where prisoners mined, logged, and built under brutal conditions. The famine and the Gulag were interconnected. Starvation in the countryside fed the camps with a constant stream of victims. Surviving deportation meant confronting another death sentence in the permafrost. For Stalin, deportation served multiple purposes. It removed potential resistance from Ukrainian villages, provided cheap labor for massive industrial projects, and instilled fear across society. In Ukraine, entire communities were hollowed out, their cultural and social life destroyed. Deportation was therefore not only a tool of punishment but also an extension of the famine's function, to break the peasantry and enforce total submission to the Soviet state. The cultural and national dimension, Ukraine as a target. The famine struck hardest in Ukraine, and this was not coincidental. Beyond its role as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, Ukraine possessed a strong national identity, nurtured by a cultural renaissance in the 1920s. Ukrainian language, literature, and education flourished under Korenizatsiya. But by the early 1930s, Moscow viewed this as dangerous nationalism. The Holodomor coincided with a broader assault on Ukrainian culture. Intellectuals, writers, and clergy were arrested or executed. Schools promoting Ukrainian language were closed, and cultural institutions dismantled. The famine silenced not only the countryside but also the voices of national expression. Starving peasants could not resist, and educated elites were terrorized into silence. Many historians argue this dual campaign, starvation in the villages and repression in the cities, reveals the famine's genocidal dimension. It was not simply about feeding Moscow's factories but about crushing Ukrainian independence of spirit. By destroying both the body and the voice of the nation, Stalin ensured that Ukraine remained under tight Soviet control. International reactions and Western silence. Despite the catastrophic scale of the Holodomor, the international response was muted. Reports of famine did circulate. Journalists such as Gareth Jones, who traveled through Ukraine in 1933, described starving villages and skeletal peasants. His accounts shocked some observers, but they were quickly overshadowed by denial. Influential correspondents in Moscow, like Walter Duranty of the New York Times, downplayed or dismissed the famine, arguing that food shortages were exaggerated. Duranty's reports, shaped by access to Soviet officials, contributed to global silence. Governments also had political motives to look away. The Soviet Union was an important trading partner and a rising industrial power. Western nations, struggling with the Great Depression, were reluctant to jeopardize relations. Recognition of Stalin's regime took precedence over humanitarian outrage. Few international aid efforts were mounted, and Moscow actively blocked foreign assistance, insisting that no famine existed. In Ukrainian diaspora communities, especially in Canada and the United States, activists tried to raise awareness, but their voices were marginalized amid geopolitical concerns. This silence deepened the tragedy, millions died unseen, and their suffering was obscured by propaganda. Only decades later, after the collapse of the USSR, did the Holodomor gain wider international recognition as a deliberate atrocity. Comparisons with other famines in history. The Holodomor stands out among the world's great famines because of its man-made nature, but it invites comparison with other tragedies. The Irish potato famine, 1845 to 1852, killed about 1 million people, driven partly by British colonial policies that prioritized exports over relief. Similarly, the Great Chinese Famine, 1959 to 1961. Under Mao's Great Leap Forward claimed tens of millions of lives due to forced collectivization and state denial of hunger. Yet the Holodomor had unique features. Unlike natural crop failures in Ireland, Ukraine's fertile fields still produced grain, it was confiscated and exported. Unlike China, where policy errors spiraled into disaster, Stalin's leadership maintained strict awareness of hunger in Ukraine but chose to continue requisitions. The famine also coincided with targeted cultural repression, giving it a distinctly national character. By comparing these famines, historians highlight recurring themes: the weaponization of food, the role of ideology, and the deadly consequences of political denial. But the Holodomor remains singular in the way hunger was consciously deployed to weaken a nation. It was not only an economic failure but a calculated tool of domination. Historiographical debate: genocide or policy failure? From the moment information about the Holodomor began to emerge, scholars and politicians have debated its nature. Was it a tragic result of reckless policies, or was it a deliberate act of genocide against the Ukrainian people? Those who argue for policy failure emphasize that collectivization and grain requisitioning were imposed across the Soviet Union, and other regions also suffered hunger. They suggest the famine was the unintended consequence of unrealistic quotas, poor administration, and Stalin's obsession with industrialization. From this perspective, the Holodomor reflects the brutality of the Soviet system, but not necessarily genocidal intent. In contrast, the genocide interpretation, widely embraced in Ukraine and recognized by many governments, highlights the deliberate targeting of Ukrainians. Evidence shows that Stalin tightened borders around Ukraine, blacklisted entire villages, and simultaneously crushed Ukrainian cultural institutions. Food was exported abroad while peasants starved at home. This combination of policies, critics argue, demonstrates conscious intent to destroy a national group, fitting the definition of genocide under international law. The debate remains alive today. For many Ukrainians, recognition as genocide is not only about history but about identity, justice, and resisting ongoing attempts to deny their suffering. For others, the Holodomor illustrates how ideology and authoritarianism can cause mass death even without explicit extermination orders. Either way, it remains one of the most lethal man-made famines in human history. Legacy and memory. The Holodomor left deep scars on Ukraine. Beyond the millions of dead, it shattered trust, silenced voices, and reshaped society. Survivors carried trauma for decades, often afraid to speak about their experiences under continued Soviet repression. Families lost entire branches of kin, villages disappeared, and traditions were broken. After Stalin's death, official Soviet discourse remained silent. Only whispers within households and diaspora communities kept memory alive. It was not until the late 1980s, during Perestroika, that the famine began to be openly discussed within Ukraine. After independence in 1991, the Holodomor became central to Ukrainian national identity. Memorials were built, testimonies collected, and November was declared a national day of remembrance. Internationally, recognition has grown, with many parliaments declaring the Holodomor a genocide. Yet debates continue, particularly in Russia, where acknowledgement remains politically sensitive. The famine's legacy is not just about history but about contemporary struggles over sovereignty, memory, and truth. For Ukrainians today, the Holodomor is a reminder of both tragedy and resilience, a symbol of immense suffering, but also of survival against the odds. Its memory underscores the importance of safeguarding food, freedom. Conclusion: Lessons of the Holodomor for the world. The Holodomor remains one of the starkest warnings in modern history about the dangers of authoritarian power and the weaponization of resources. It was not drought or nature that killed millions, but deliberate human decisions, policies that prioritized ideology, control, and industrial goals over human survival. Stalin's government treated food not as a right but as a tool of domination, proving how a regime could transform abundance into famine through coercion and terror. For Ukraine, the Holodomor is both a national trauma and a foundation of identity. It taught generations the fragility of freedom and the cost of silence. For the world, it is a reminder that state denial and propaganda can obscure even the greatest human tragedies, allowing suffering to unfold in the shadows. International hesitation in the 1930s demonstrates how political expediency often outweighs humanitarian responsibility. A lesson still relevant in contemporary crises. The famine also underscores the link between culture and survival. By targeting both the bodies of peasants and the voices of intellectuals, the Soviet regime sought to erase a nation's independence of spirit. Remembering the Holodomor, therefore, is not only about mourning the dead but also about affirming the resilience of Ukrainian identity in the face of attempted destruction. Ultimately, the Holodomor shows how hunger can be used as a weapon, and how unchecked power can devastate millions. Its lessons demand vigilance, that societies resist lies, defend truth, and protect the vulnerable. To honor the victims is to ensure that such a tragedy, born of human cruelty rather than natural necessity, is never repeated. Stalin's bloody legacy. Joseph Stalin's name has become synonymous with terror, repression, and the immense human suffering inflicted under his rule. His legacy, often described as a bloody inheritance, was built on policies of systematic violence against individuals, classes, and entire nations. While the Soviet Union under his leadership industrialized rapidly and emerged victorious in World War II, the cost was staggering: tens of millions of lives destroyed through famine, deportation, war, and the Gulag. Stalin's reign demonstrated how absolute power, fused with paranoia and ideology, could turn an empire into a prison and its citizens into disposable instruments. One of the darkest aspects of Stalin's rule was the campaign of ethnic deportations and national repression. Entire communities were branded as traitors and uprooted from their homelands. The Volga Germans, Crimean Tatars, Chechens, Ingush, Kalmyks, and many others were accused of collaborating with enemies or harboring nationalist ambitions. In reality, most were innocent. Families were loaded into cattle cars, transported across thousands of kilometers to Siberia or Central Asia, and left to survive in barren steppe or frozen taiga. Many died on the journey, many more perished from cold, hunger, and disease in their new settlements. Stalin used these deportations as a tool of punishment and control, ensuring that no ethnic minority could threaten Moscow's dominance. The trauma of exile has remained etched into the collective memory of these peoples, shaping their identities long after Stalin's death. The Gulag system, initially designed as corrective labor camps, expanded massively under Stalin and became a central pillar of his rule. Millions of prisoners. Political opponents, intellectuals, peasants resisting collectivization, ordinary citizens accused of trivial crimes, were swallowed by this archipelago of camps. Conditions were brutal: forced labor in mines, forests, and construction projects under freezing temperatures, with little food and constant abuse. Mortality rates soared, especially in remote regions like Kolyma. The Gulag was not just punishment but also a form of economic exploitation, providing cheap labor for Stalin's ambitious industrial projects. By the late 1940s, the Gulag held millions, serving as both a symbol of fear and a reservoir of forced manpower. During World War II, Stalin's bloody legacy deepened. The Soviet Union bore the brunt of Nazi aggression, suffering more than 20 million deaths. While victory in 1945 remains a source of pride, the way Stalin managed the war highlighted his ruthlessness. Soldiers were often sent into battle with inadequate food, clothing, or weapons. The infamous Order No. 227, not one step back, authorized blocking detachments to shoot any soldier who retreated. Prisoners of war who returned from German captivity were branded as traitors and sent to Gulag camps upon liberation. Civilians behind the front lines endured scorched earth policies, forced evacuations, and relentless requisitions. Stalin's leadership achieved victory but at a human cost so severe that it scarred Soviet society for generations. Even after the war ended, Stalin refused to loosen his grip. Instead, he launched new waves of post-war repression. Intellectuals, artists, and scientists were accused of cosmopolitanism or Western influence. The so-called Doctor's Plot of 1952, though halted by Stalin's death, showed his continuing paranoia. Dozens of Jewish doctors were accused of conspiring to kill Soviet leaders. Returning Soviet soldiers and prisoners of war were viewed with suspicion, many were imprisoned or exiled. Rather than enjoying peace after years of devastation, Soviet citizens remained trapped in an atmosphere of fear and surveillance. Central to Stalin's bloody legacy was the cult of personality. Propaganda elevated him to near-divine status, the father of nations, the great leader, the genius of humanity. Portraits, statues, and songs glorified him, while history books erased rivals and credited him with every success. At the same time, ordinary people lived in constant anxiety, knowing that a careless word or association could lead to arrest. The cult served not just to inspire loyalty but to reinforce the climate of fear. Stalin was everywhere, in schools, in workplaces, in homes, an omnipresent figure who demanded devotion and punished even imagined disloyalty. The human and moral cost of Stalin's rule is almost incalculable. Historians estimate that between 20 and 30 million people died as a direct or indirect result of his policies, through famine, such as the Holodomor in Ukraine, executions, deportations, Gulag labor, and war. Entire generations were scarred, families broken, and communities erased. Beyond physical death, Stalin's regime inflicted moral wounds. Trust was destroyed as neighbors denounced one another, children were taught to betray their parents, and truth itself became subordinate to propaganda. Fear became the organizing principle of society. After Stalin's death in 1953, his successor Nikita Khrushchev denounced many of his crimes in the famous secret speech of 1956. This began the process known as the thaw. When political prisoners were released, censorship relaxed somewhat, and Stalin's cult was partially dismantled. Yet his shadow remained long after. Many older generations continued to revere him as the wartime leader who defeated Hitler, while others quietly remembered the terror he unleashed. In Russia and other former Soviet republics today, debates about Stalin's legacy continue, reflecting the unresolved tension between pride in Soviet achievements and acknowledgement of the immense suffering behind them. In conclusion, Stalin's bloody legacy is defined not by his economic projects or even by military victory, but by the rivers of blood shed to sustain his rule. Through deportations, Gulag camps, wartime ruthlessness, post-war repression, and the cult of personality, Stalin created a system where millions were sacrificed to the state's demands. His reign shows how absolute power, unchecked by morality or accountability, can devastate entire nations. Remembering this legacy is essential not only for honoring the victims but for guarding against the return of such tyranny in any form. Stalin's empire of fear may have ended in 1953, but its lessons remain urgent, that humanity must resist the temptation to justify cruelty in the name of progress, and that truth must be defended even when lies hold power. Joseph Stalin left behind a deeply contradictory legacy. On the one hand, he was credited with contributing to the victory over Nazi Germany, but on the other, he remains one of the bloodiest tyrants in human history. Historians estimate that the number of people who died as a result of his policies and crimes ranges from 20 to 30 million. In humanity's memory, Stalin is not only the man of steel, but also the man who turned an entire empire into a vast graveyard.